Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of our 3-part videos on Tara June Winch's novel Swallow the Air. In the previous video, we've taken a look at a plot summary, an introduction to the author, and then a good look at the Aboriginal background and context of this novel. However, now we're going to be examining the way in which you can apply this novel to the idea of belonging and develop a very sophisticated essay surrounding these themes. So let's examine the concept of wide reading and textual resources. So it's really important that once you're familiar with your text and that you've read it, you can start using other resources to develop your understanding. Now you can use quotes or ideas from critics. However, it's important not to plagiarize this material, but use it to develop your personal understanding. So taking all of this into account, we're now going to examine a second opinion. And that opinion is a novel review by Sophia Romano. This sort of novel review is an example of the sort of thing which you can take from the internet, from a newspaper, from a magazine, and really use it to your advantage in taking out some ideas about what this novel means to other people who've read it and who've thought about it. This quote from Sophia Romano states, "Winch builds the story in small pearls, between which the reader actively participates. The chapters of Winch's story interchange like the scenes of a film." So here's just really doing some structural analysis. And what you'll see is that the innovative structure of the novel is really reflected through this work because the short story chapter structure builds the narrative and really almost makes the reader feel like they're watching a film, like these shards of the narrative are unfolding, and as they're unfolding, you're learning more and more about the characters and the ideas. So it's really quite interesting that she describes it with this metaphor of the pearls, like the pearls on a necklace, all really coming together and building up a really excellent story. This idea of the slow reveal of belonging is also relevant to your themes. Nothing in this novel is particularly obvious at first. It's one of those works that you read and you're not entirely sure the first time you read it what it's about until you slowly keep reading and more details are unfolded and it becomes more obvious. So it's quite a beautiful way of constructing a work. The next quote, "In this respect, Swallow the Air nestles snugly in the semi-autobiographical framework favoured by first novelists." So as we've discussed, really what this book does is draws upon the author's own personal experiences and then traces the way in which she can use her own experiences as inspiration for writing this character of May. Winch's own experience contribute to the writing of this story, however, it's not completely her own story. It's not just an autobiography and it's not a biography, it's simply just something which is inspired by personal experience. Her own sense of belonging to family and culture are therefore really well reflected by the work. So the sense of belonging in this novel is quite authentic because it really deals with issues that she has personally experienced and then just has to express. A sense of poignancy and sadness underlines these moments. They are inevitably overshadowed by the crushing dark forces of drugs, poverty, racism, and violence. So here what the review is talking about is the fact that it's not just, even though there are sort of quite beautiful happy scenes throughout the novel, even when you're reading these seem quite sad due to the fact that you know the reality behind the situation. So what she's demonstrating is factual research and presentation of realism. So the author has really gone away and developed a work which speaks absolutely accurately about current situations. So about things like drugs, poverty, racism, and violence. And she captures that in a really realistic way through her writing. The struggle to belong in a broken world is therefore also explored through this really grim reality which she paints the picture of for you. So let's take a look at the specific way that belonging themes link to your text. So these ideas, you can pick out, use some of them when you're writing essays, focus on the ones which you think are most important, and also the ones which relate to your additional material the best. So the Aboriginal sense of belonging to land and connections to nature, finding belonging in an unexpected environment, the choice to belong or not to belong, the barriers to belonging for Aboriginal Australians, the search for belonging, belonging through storytelling in the Aboriginal culture, and also belonging to custom, culture, and family. So we're going to take a look at all of these themes in detail now and look at some examples of techniques and quotes which you can use to prove your analysis through each of these themes. So when we're analysing these themes, we're going to look at 3 issues. Firstly, what does the theme mean? So a bit of an explanation of what that actually means. Secondly, what are some quotes to support the theme? So I picked out specific examples from the text which we'll examine. And also, how can I focus on belonging? So how can I bring this theme, these techniques and these quotes back to my area of study and back to those keywords in that rubric? So if we take a look at the first theme, the theme is Aboriginal belonging to place and land. Now this is something which we've discussed in the cultural and historical background section earlier on, that deep connection between Aboriginal people and the land. So this is definitely something which is reflected in the title. Swallow the Air really suggests that connection to the elements. She's appreciating nature and the way that it really nurtures Indigenous people as a cultural group. So the idea of swallowing the air, almost imagining that that air is food, that it's nourishing her, and that it's giving her life. This also shows an appreciation for Aboriginal customs and the dream time, where obviously that connection to the land was very essential. If you take a look at this quote, we come from the sky and the earth, and we go back to the sky and the earth, bone and fluid. So here you have that repetition of the sky and the earth, the sky of the earth. And that's really an indication of the fact that they had quite a cyclical belief about life and death. Humans came from the land and then went back to the land, so that they always belonged, no matter what state they were in, they were always finding that connection to the land. And that's a really good indication of that theme in this text. Also, this more simple quote, they belong to this place, which May states, is just a really good indication of the fact that Aboriginal people find belonging not only to the natural environment, but also to the environments which they as a community build together, such as the block and red fern. If we take a look at this next theme, that's the idea of finding belonging in an unexpected environment. The opening of the novel really shows the childish innocence of May in her new environment, because basically what's happened is she's been brought from her dead mother to the big overwhelming town of Sydney, and she doesn't quite understand how to survive in this new town. So she's living in an imagined world and does not expect to find belonging in this harsh block environment. So when she finds belonging and she finds this sense of realism and family connections and ties with people, that's quite unexpected for her because it's not something which she expects to find. This quote here, I'm in Sydney, in a pagoda, sipping Japanese tea, or a castle where I wait for a carriage made of baked pumpkin. So here we have these sort of references to things which seem like a little bit fantastical. So the beautiful idea of Japanese tea with the pagoda and the cherry blossoms and all that sort of thing. And then also this fairy tale reference to the carriage with the baked pumpkin. So the sort of Cinderella story. So here we really get the impression that May doesn't belong to the real world at this point. She's belonging to this imagined world in her own mind, which she's using to escape the hardships and the confusion which she's seeing around her. This next theme is basically the choice to belong or not to belong. Now, this is something specifically in your rubric, so something you might want to take a look at yourself. What happens in the novel is there's a contrast of horrors and sort of the awful environment of the block and the way that people live in hardship there, to the light-hearted, simple scenes where you really see some beautiful family interactions. For example, scenes at the beach. So here's where you really get to see the author's beautiful writing come out, and that's where you get a contrast to the more dark sections of the work. The quote, drunk on salt air and laughter, is just a really sort of beautiful metaphor which shows that they're so happy because they're so in touch with the beautiful air and water and the sand that they're absolutely drunk with happiness. This contrasts with abuse and mistreatment of the Aboriginal people, which really becomes a barrier to belonging and which affects that choice not to belong, perhaps through the subconscious decision that Aboriginal people have, maybe that they don't feel like they belong to a more mainstream culture. So that's definitely a really sad element which is addressed through this work. This quote here, bloody millennium come and gone and they still can't treat our people right. So here you have that very colloquial language of the bloody and they come and gone, so the sort of incorrect grammar, to capture that dialect of the Aboriginal person talking. However, you then also have this idea that the Aboriginal people have been very oppressed and that because they've been mistreated, they've been outcast and don't really belong to that society which they should belong to because it is their own country and their own land. The next belonging theme is the barriers to belonging for Aboriginal Australians. Now, we've already touched on this briefly, but the focus of this novel is definitely on the hardships for Aboriginal Australians. However, this is then juxtaposed with the lyrical prose writing style. So you get that contrast between Tara June Winch's beautiful ability to write in such poetic prose and the really harsh subject matter which she's writing about. So it's a bit of a surprising juxtaposition there, because what she's dealing with is hard issues like drugs, alcohol, gambling, violence and crime. However, because she's writing about it in such a beautiful way, sometimes we almost forget that what she's writing about is as intense as it is. So this quote is actually describing a drug addict. However, if you read it, you wouldn't necessarily know that because it's such a beautiful description. Her clothes fell from her as though shedding themselves in the heat. She was wilting in a puddle of peach-tiled water. So really there you have that beautiful poetic sense. It's very singsong and lilting. However, it's also describing a really awful scene of a drug addict. So you have that contrast between Aboriginals not belonging to their environment, but also Tara June Winch showing that they do on this sort of subconscious level. This other quote, "Uncles drinking, thinking under bread and butter. People giving their whole dole to the bowl that is empty, that they turn right over as if they got plenty." So even though this is prose, it's full sentences, it's not poetry. She's here using the technique of rhyme to really make it really beautiful and very poetic in its style. So that contrast between the lilting, poetic and sing-song style with the awful content is quite shocking for the reader. The next belonging theme is the idea of the search for belonging. Now, May's personal struggle is obviously the focus of this work, particularly because she feels she belongs to both cultures halfway. So she kind of feels belonging to the sort of Aboriginal culture and kind of feels it to a non-Aboriginal culture, and she doesn't quite know where she stands. However, these ideas of cycles of abuse and family dysfunction are also in this search which she undertakes, and they're sort of barriers which she must overcome in the long run to achieve that sense of belonging to whatever culture she decides she wants to belong to. You get the irony of the place called Paradise Parade. It sounds like such a beautiful place where everyone belongs. However, really, it's a place of detrimental lifestyle and hardship. So that relationship there of irony is being used by the author to show just how terrible the situation is sometimes. This quote, "slices of scum," uses that scathing S alliteration to show just how awful the environment really was. In addition, the idea of the structure in itself also definitely leads to the concept of the search for belonging. It's very much a quest structure in that May, who's the hero, is really undertaking a personal journey. So this is basically occurring through the fact that this novel is written in 20 narrative shards in a novella structure. So the whole book very much becomes to be like a search, a very slow reveal, where as you're reading it, more and more details are coming to play. And as May is searching for that sense of belonging, you too feel like you're searching for that with her. So it's very much the notion that the search leads to belonging, and as you go on that search, that's reflected in the text structure. The next theme is the idea of belonging through storytelling in Aboriginal culture. Now, this is reflected in form through the first-person language. The I perspective throughout the book suggests that this is May's story and she's sharing it in her own quest to find belonging. So she's telling this story, she's telling her own perspective, and then using that to almost order her ideas and realize what she wants as a person. So the quote, "I felt Aboriginal because Mum had made me proud to be. Told me I got magic and courage from the Guriaji, the spirit man. I felt like I belonged." So there you actually have a direct reference to belonging in "I felt like I belonged." But you really see through the first person pronouns and through the mentions of the very personal "my mum" and the references to her culture that she really is finding that sense of belonging through traditional means such as storytelling. So her mother has told her that she's belonged, and so she believes that and then wants to demonstrate that through her own story, which she will now tell. The final belonging theme, which we can examine, is this concept of belonging to custom, culture, and family. The interwoven Aboriginal Dreamtime stories are really elements of culture which are interspersed in this work and give you a really good idea of how important culture is to this Aboriginal society. So the contrast between the harsh present and the beautiful legends really allow you to take something from the legends. So you read them and they become life lessons, they become little intertextual links and allegories. So they're telling you a story and teaching you a message. If you look at this quote, whales swimming the cool currents, cursing jellyfish, still angry about losing his canoe and being tricked by the other animals. So you have these references to animals who are almost becoming like characters. So they're telling the story, and you having an understanding of this Aboriginal story is helping you to understand the culture more, belong to the text, and also see the way in which the Aboriginal people find belonging in this beautiful culture which they have. There's also a sense of not belonging to family through this cycle of abuse and violence, however. So, for example, the father hits the mother, and his aim is perfect like a sunset. That's really where that surprising imagery comes in again. It's a very surprising comparison. You don't expect, a man hitting his wife to be described as perfect like a sunset. So that's where Winch is again really challenging you as a reader. And it's where it's really important that you understand the language in order to really understand her message about belonging. So we've come to an end on this section of the video, so part 2. In this section, we've really examined the way in which you can create an essay from this novel. So looking at some extra sources and then going through these belonging themes, we've really come to the point where you can definitely write about this novel in a lot of detail. If you join us in just a moment in part 3, we'll go on to examine specific language techniques in the work and how you can use these in your essay.